in reality, this all should have been done in the Situation Room. Why wasn't it? We don't know for sure, but my guess is that President Trump is not using the National Security Council the way previous presidents had.
You're listening to the USSC Briefing Room, a podcast from the United States Study Center at the University of Sydney, where we give you a seat at the table for a USSC briefing on the latest developments in U.S. news and foreign policy. We'll cover what you need to know and what's beneath the surface of the news. Hello, I'm Mari Kirk, Director of Engagement and Impact at the United States Study Center. Thanks for joining us on the USSC Briefing Room. Just before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're recording on today. The University of Sydney is located on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and future. When U.S. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz set up a Signal group chat to coordinate principles for discussions on a U.S. strike on the Houthis in Yemen, he had no idea that the world would soon be privy to this private conversation. But using insecure channels for information sharing is hardly unique to this administration. From Hillary Clinton's use of Gmail to President Trump storing classified documents in a bathroom at Mar-a-Lago, there's a consistent trend of government officials violating information security protocols. As technology advances, why do government officials consistently turn to insecure platforms for communication? And will Signalgate become a turning point in government use of communication technology? And how could this incident impact relationships with the Five Eyes or other intel sharing partners of the United States? To discuss these issues, I'm joined by USSC CEO, Dr. Michael Green, and USSC lecturer in American Studies, Dr. Catherine Robinson. Mike served in the White House National Security Council during the George W. Bush administration, and Kat is also a senior research fellow at the Australian Centre for Space Governance and has expertise in political communication. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And at the end of the episode, we'll get your by the numbers stats. So I'm curious to find out about what you have to share with us on the topic. But let's just start by setting the stage. How did the editor-in-chief for The Atlantic, and who's also a known Trump critic, get added to this private chat for administration officials who are planning this attack on the Houthis?
So we just had some recent reporting from The Guardian that said that Goldberg's number was likely saved in Waltz's iPhone because the journalist's number was in an email that was forwarded by Brian Hughes, who's the National Security Council spokesman, via copying and pasting it into a text message that got sent to Waltz. You might all be familiar with when you get new numbers and contacts, there's a little pop-up that says, would you like to update this number for such and such contact? So it was saved as that and not as a separate or new contact. And that's according, as I said, to reporting by The Guardian from a White House forensic review.
And the interesting thing with that as well is a couple of things. One is that it's somewhat relatable because people have it automatically share and update that. But the reason Waltz was put in contact with Goldberg was because he was a surrogate during the Trump campaign and there was a touchy issue. And so he was nominated as the person to respond to this. And then I think the Guardian article said that he ended up not even calling him back. He didn't even respond to them. So he was nominated, but didn't end up contacting him. And the other thing that's interesting is the fact that it seems like a lot of the Trump supporters or the MAGA world, the thing they were most upset about in this issue wasn't the fact that this, sensitive information was sharing that might have put U.S. soldiers at risk. It's that why did the National Security Advisor have the phone number of a journalist who's a known Trump critic on their phone? Deeply concerned about that. But that explanation might appease some of those critics. So what do you think? Is it normal for government officials to use Signal or apps like that? And if so, why? How is it supposed to be used?
Well, first of all, on Goldberg being in Waltz's iPhone, not totally surprising to me. I worked in the White House for 4.5 years and was a senior advisor to the president, ran the Asia office. We would have a heads up that a journalist that we didn't like had something damning on us, a leaked piece of information. So we would sometimes call another journalist who didn't like us, but at least was fair. So my good friend David Sanger at the New York Times, more than once I was told to call Sanger, brief him, because sometimes you wanted somebody who looks like a critic hitting you on something will be worse if it's somebody else. And so there's nothing wrong with Mike Waltz, the national security advisor, or his deputies talking to journalists, including journalists who disagree with the president. That's pretty normal even in Trump world. There's also nothing surprising about senior political figures being so busy they don't want to use secure communications. As you said, Hillary Clinton was a bit careless. Sandy Berger snuck things out of the National Archives in his socks. I mean, it's stuff that happens at high levels of government from time to time that, frankly, someone at my level or lower would have been fired for. And there's a little bit of immunity for people at that level, which is unfortunate because you need to deter the senior-most people in addition to the almost senior people like I was. It's convenient. Now, why were they on Signal in the first place? The reality is the way the National Security Council system is supposed to work since the National Security Act of 1947, and each president sets it up differently, but basically these most sensitive discussions happen in the Situation Room at the White House, which is extremely secure, and you can have candid conversations. So what this said to me is they are probably not having regular National Security Council meetings. And so Mike Waltz, the National Security Advisor, to get the key people like the Secretary of Defense and others on the same page, so to speak, resorted to Signal. In reality, this all should have been done in the Situation Room. Why wasn't it? We don't know for sure, but my guess is that President Trump is not using the National Security Council the way previous presidents had. If you're the National Security Advisor, by the way, the National Security Advisor is not listed in the National Security Act of 1947. All it says is there will be an executive secretary at the NSC. The only people listed are the Secretary of State, Defense, and so forth. So when you're the National Security Advisor, your power comes from how much the president wants you to get the other cabinet members in the room, hammer out a decision, give the options to the president. I don't know for sure, but what this says to me is that President Trump is not doing that. And the rest of the cabinet doesn't see a process the president wants to use. And the famous expert on this, Peter Rodman, wrote a book called Presidential Command, which basically said you get the National Security Council that the president deserves. And if President Trump didn't want to use the National Security Council system and have people in their busy day come to the White House, go to the Situation Room, hammer these things out in a secure environment, then probably Mike Waltz had to resort to Signal, which is encrypted, but obviously not secure, really.
Yeah.
He, I think, will survive this in part because despite this lapse, he's viewed in the Congress and by a lot of U.S. allies as a pretty steady hand, actually, and pretty focused on alliances and security. And so, people said someone's head has to roll, but members of Congress didn't want Mike Waltz because he's one of the people they trust. So he may escape it, but it's definitely not helpful for his position as National Security Advisor that this happened.
Yeah, he'll be on thin ice, and if he's done other things that will frustrate President Trump, that might come out later. So you mentioned the Situation Room, and I've also, we talk about SCIFs. We have SCIFs in Australia, things like that. Like, what sort of channels, in addition to the Situation Room, should be used for this sort of sensitive communication?
Well, I mean, if you want to have what they were doing, which is a discussion of pros and cons on a major policy move, then you do it in the Situation Room. Sometimes you do it in the Oval Office with the president. Sometimes you delegate it to people a rank or two below. What was curious about the Signalgate was it was all different ranks mixed together. It was cabinet secretaries, it was random advisors, but normally you would have a process. Every administration except this one comes in on day one, the first presidential directive, National Security Presidential Directive for Republicans, Democrats call it something different. The first one they put out is, here's how decision-making will work. We're going to have principals committee meetings, deputies committee meetings on X numbers of days in the White House at the Situation Room. State will be in charge of this part. NSC will be in charge of that part. And there's a system for decision-making. And it's a little different for each president, but they put out that directive. It's usually not public, so we don't know for sure if the Trump administration did it or not, but it seems like they didn't. And so there is a way. People who've been in this business know how you do it. This one's much more ad hoc, which seems to be the president's management style.
And have we seen any advancements in technology in this space, either in, what White House officials or government officials would use for something this sensitive, or for if there's other communications that wouldn't be as sensitive but might be used to point someone towards something? Are there new technologies being used that are a more secure way of having conversations?
So the technologies that we use for these types of encrypted digital communications are relatively stable. So there's a standard called the Advanced Encryption Standard -256, which stands for 256 bits. I heard someone recently put it, and I apologize that I can't recall his name, but it was on the Politico Tech podcast, that says better encryption just means more math. So thus far, anyone who hasn't been in possession of one of those encryption keys has not been able to break the AES 256 standard. So we are constantly developing more advanced ways to encrypt digital data, especially when we think about quantum computing. And what's important about quantum computing is that it just has the capacity to do much more mathematical equations, so that it's just a capacity for a more complex encryption. And we're also involving things like AI and machine learning in these encryption techniques. But all of this is predicated on something that's really concerning, and I think Mike could also speak to this, is that the single most vulnerable point of weakness for these encryption technologies is the human user. And so while we are developing technology, I recently read about something called steganography, which has been around for a while, but it's where a piece of information is hidden within another piece of information. So you could have like a picture of a cat, but inside that picture of a cat is a plan for an attack. And in 2023, a group of Oxford University and Carnegie Mellon researchers actually perfected this so that you cannot see the information under that original image. So there's all these fascinating ways of encrypting data. But again, all of it is predicated on a human user. And when you have human users, that's a point of failure. So using something like a personal device for secure communications, we know that they're incredibly vulnerable, especially as those devices might not even be within the United States in the instance of Signalgate. So while we are developing technologies that make communications more secure, those technologies are only as strong as the humans who are using them.
And I think even, like you said, maybe not being in the country, I can't remember the name of which person it was, but I think one of the officials in the chat was in Russia at the time when all these messages were happening. And those phones are far more likely to be targeted when you're in a location like that when you're traveling.
He did say that he didn't have his personal device on him in a communication on X, that he only had a government-issued device. And I believe there was some reporting that shows that he did have no access to that Signal chat during the time. But we do also know that Tulsi Gabbard, who did have access during the time, she was traveling throughout the Indo-Pacific during this as well.
It's fascinating, isn't it? So how does this use of unofficial channels compared to, Mike, you mentioned Hillary Clinton's use of emails, things like that, or, we've had the classified documents is something we've heard a lot about over the past few years, because both President Biden and President Trump both had classified documents in private residences where they shouldn't have been. So how does the conversation on Signal, where the U.S. Secretary of Defense was sharing attack plans around like when, bombs would take off, when there'd be impact, what was happening. And I think even the name of a CIA operative was shared in this thread as well. How does that compare with the sort of things that Hillary Clinton was sharing on Gmail or other lapses in information sharing protocol in the past?
Signal is preferred by government officials or congressional staff to regular email for what's called SBU, sensitive but unclassified. And so it is better. I mean, you could make the argument, well, at least they were using Signal. That's encrypted, which Secretary Clinton's Gmail was not. On the other hand, they were talking about stuff that I think most experts looking at it said was not SBU. It was classified. And, the administration has tried to play different games saying, well, it wasn't technically a war plan. And technically that's right. there's a strict template for what's in a war plan, and that wasn't what this was. But it was it's sort of like saying, I didn't steal the cookie from the cookie jar, but you ate all the chocolate chips. Like the most sensitive stuff was in there. So they were playing kind of a semantic game. And so which is worse? Partisans will say Hillary's was worse because Gmail's not encrypted at all, and her laptop and all that was accessible. But then Democrats will say, well, if she wasn't doing highly sensitive or classified stuff like you were doing on Signal. I think generally, I'll preview by the numbers. I think the American public knows the difference, and it gets that this was a particularly bad breach.
And were you in DC at the time that this became public?
I was in Washington right after it happened.
Okay. So what sort of reactions were you hearing from the people you were talking to in Washington?
Everyone was making jokes. Everyone was making jokes. Do you want to meet for coffee, or should we just get on Signal? It was sort of not quite gallows humor, because people in the national security space who've been in government thought it was pretty egregious. But ingredients for a lot of jokes.
Yeah. That's funny. And what sort of security risks do we have from using a platform like Signal, and how is technology evolving to address these concerns? Like Kat, you mentioned, how, AI and machine learning are becoming part of this encryption process. Although interesting, another question is, would AI and machine learning also make them more vulnerable? Can they be used on, the opposite side to help decrypt encrypted messages? So I guess what are the risks, and what's happening with technology in terms of addressing and mitigating these risks?
I think just to go back to something I said earlier, the biggest risk is the human user. And sort of echo what Mike said, Signal is being used, or Gmail is being used, because of personal convenience. And part of it is, at that level, people sometimes feel they're above the regulations that are set there to protect national security, or they may be trying to circumvent something like the Presidential Records Act to keep that in case of oversight. There might be some feelings around what happened in the first Trump administration with the classified records. Well, okay, if no one knows what we're doing, then there can't be oversight over what's happening. So I think some of that is there's just, one is convenience. What's easier? It's much more difficult to get into a SCIF or to be in the Situation Room. Some of it could be lack of coordination. But again, that biggest risk for me comes back to the human user. So whatever the reason is, when you're using these systems out of convenience rather than following what is correct, you're going to have vulnerabilities. In terms of technology, I think you're right about AI. It can sort of work on both sides. When AI is used to strengthen sort of encryption and respond in real time to attacks, then that's going to strengthen that. But it can also be used, if you think about, where does the data live? What's the supply chain of AI and machine learning? Are you using something where the data warehouses are kept somewhere that is vulnerable to either intrusion physically or through a cyber attack? So there's a lot of you can game out those risks quite far. But again, ultimately, I would just come back to say that when it comes to this, one of the biggest risks is that human user. There was reporting after this that Signal is being used regularly. I think it was the Washington Post said something that they were aware of at least 20 other Signal chats. And also that... and
I think they were involving Pete Hegseth as well.
Involving Pete Hegseth, and some reports that Gmail might be being used as well, which I find...
Which would be ironic.
Yeah, very ironic. And then a German newspaper reported that they actually found the name and private contact details and some passwords of Gabbard, Hegseth, and Waltz online on the internet, and used a commercial service that could say that some of those emails or the WhatsApp were accessed, at the time of their publication. So this was post Signalgate. So again, that just comes back to me that we evolve extremely sophisticated systems and encryption, and we're using AI, machine learning, we're using quantum computing to make very secure platforms, but we can't guarantee the security because of that user error.
Yeah, and it's an interesting point as well about the official records. Aside from the information security, is that all these official conversations are meant to be recorded. I mean, the reason the classified documents that were, in Biden's Delaware garage and in bathroom at Mar-a-Lago, the people that were chasing them down initially were the National Archives, because all those sorts of documents are meant to be archived afterwards. They're meant to be kept and recorded over time. And the thing with Signal is the messages are set to usually delete after a certain period of time. Mike, when you were in the White House, or I guess even when you were then leaving the White House, was that something you were aware of, is how these messages, conversations, things were going to be captured and recorded and stored? Or was it something that happened in the background that you never had to think about?
100% aware. Like, we were so briefed on this when we came in. And it all goes into presidential records, including emails I sent to my then girlfriend on the unclassified system asking if she wanted to go on a date and being told, no, I have to polish my banister this weekend. And so my kids someday will be able to go to the George W. Bush Presidential Library and declassify my now wife rebuffing me. So even if it's personal, if it's on this was not a classified email. This was just the unclassified thing you'd use for anyone, but it had my White House address and all. And so it became presidential records. So my dating history even,
Wow.
President Trump won on a kind of anti-establishment, bring in sort of, change agents like Elon Musk and Tulsi Gabbard. And there are consequences when you do that. So one thing they did was they fired pretty much everyone at the NSC. That's the first time ever. Every administration, like when I came in at the beginning of the Bush administration, probably 3/4 of the other officials at the NSC had been there for President Clinton. And they're seconded. The people who are directly hired by the president go. But the people who are seconded from the State Department or Treasury, they stay, and they're public servants and they're patriots. And some of them are political and ideological, and they look to get out. And some of them are working on something very technical, like foreign exchange rules or export controls, and they stay. And you need them because when the new guys come in, even if they've been in government before, it's been 4 years or more. But the NSC this time pretty much let everyone go to have a clean house, and there are consequences. So I wonder whether a lot of the people who would have been telling them about the presidential record system and how to use classified email actually weren't there. And also when you bring in people on top of that who are, you put it politely, change agents, but, without a lot of experience and without very senior experience, who have never communicated these kinds of things before. They were, Hexes was a major in the National Guard Reserves, and Tulsi Gabbard, I think, was lieutenant colonel, but that's not anywhere near the level of a secretary or director of national intelligence. So in every administration, you'll have one or two people who are former member of Congress or business person who maybe isn't used to the high levels of security of information, but there's a lot more this time who don't have that experience. So you get the staff's not there in the NSC that you need to manage the process. And then you have a lot of people who, politically you could argue you need a big change, so you needed people from outside the system, but the consequence is you get people who are not experienced handling this information. So it's not totally surprising to me this happened. The administration is doubling down and saying it was, it wasn't us, it was them. That's sort of the default position. But I think internally and with some pressure from Congress, they are going to have to tighten up to some extent. They can't keep doing this.
And so it sounds like there's, some awareness of, at least in Washington, D.C., that maybe we're operating in a less secure information environment or environment for information sharing. On a global stage right now, do you guys think that we're operating in a more secure or a less secure environment for information sharing?
It's both. So if you're in the Australian Federal Police or the FBI or MI5, it is harder to do wiretaps. And that since the 1920s or more is how they caught, drug criminals and terrorists. But now the encryption, helps hide stuff from law enforcement. the law enforcement, as Kat said, using AI it's a big game, The law enforcement side is figuring out how to use AI to get in there and find out what the bad guys are doing, but it cuts both ways. Net, I think the technology, until we figure out some responses, is making us less secure overall. I worry in particular about two things. One is disinformation. We're probably a year or two away from seeing what people call AI agents. These are basically avatars. So not just bots that go into social media and increase posts attacking democratic institutions, which the Russians are doing. It's not just bots driving up hits. It's avatars. It's AI agents that look like human beings who can adopt a personality in social media platforms and look like real human beings. And that's going to be very hard to detect and counter. Maybe we can do it, maybe we can't. But that is really going to make disinformation a lot more, potent and dangerous in a lot of places. And the other thing is, as Kat said, the vulnerability is the human being, and it always has been really more than the technology openings. It's a human being, and AI, facial recognition. The fact that electric vehicles made in China are a giant driving motorized listening platform for the Ministry of State Security, because under Chinese law, all that data goes back to them. So that's why Australian government officials cannot use those cars and cannot have conversations in electric vehicles that have, including I think Teslas maybe, because all that data is accessible. So you can't have conversations in cars unless they're old-fashioned, cars that are not linked to the internet. And if you combine AI and facial recognition and those platforms, those cars and so forth, it's going to be much easier for Chinese or Russian intelligence to find all about certain people with access to this intelligence and target them, either through technical means or through their personal vulnerabilities. So the technology perfect storm means that individuals and human beings, who are always the weak point, are going to be more easily targeted. So I'm not saying anything that governments don't know. They spend a lot of time on it, but it's kind of game on, because the counter technologies also relying on AI are going to have to develop. And then the governments are going to have to, and are putting a lot of bans on what officials are allowed to do and not do, including classified information and Signal. The problem is if officials ignore it, then you have a big problem.
And I think that's an important point that you bring up, Mike, because you have to also consider sort of the role of personality within administrations, within the Trump administration. He is a president who values loyalty over anything else. And so security concerns can take a back seat as long as he knows that the people that are closest to him are loyal to him. And so when we combine that with an erode in trust that is happening because of AI, misinformation or disinformation. And so we're seeing around the world, not just in the United States, but everywhere, that there is sort of that there is a growing sort of discontent with democratic institutions. So people are having less trust in those institutions. So it sort of creates a good environment for hostile actors to take advantage of officials using communication systems that aren't as secure, or to take advantage of spinning those stories in ways that would benefit them and could possibly harm public trust in these institutions.
So I guess my final question then is thinking about this, tense geopolitical context that we are in, how, can or will this episode impact relationships with America's information sharing partners like the Five Eyes?
Well, when you have something like this with a security or an intelligence partner, it definitely makes you think, how do we share intelligence with those guys? And by the way, it happens, with the U.S. when other allies leak things or have poor cybersecurity. So this is not a uniquely one-way thing. I mean, there are concerns in the U.S. about some of the cyber hygiene in Australia, and a lot of concerns about cyber hygiene in Japan. And so, I make that point because Five Eyes, the U.S., Australia, UK, Canada, New Zealand intelligence sharing framework, which is the most intimate in the world, or with U.S., Japan, or Korea, which are very important, or NATO. Everybody is constantly watching each other's safeguarding of intelligence, and this is the most public, but it's not the only case. It's so the fact this has happened is not going to lead allies to say, "Oh my God, this has never happened before in any of our countries." This one's kind of unique, no doubt about it. So I don't think that intelligence sharing gets cut off. Certainly not. And one reason, frankly, is, for example, in Five Eyes, which is an incredibly powerful asset for the U.S., this is a all for one and one for all. Everybody gets access. We share everything relationship, which is great. But if you look at who's bringing what to the table, it's still overwhelmingly U.S. Intelligence in all the different domains: human, SIGINT, signals intelligence, human intelligence, geospatial, meaning satellites. It's overwhelmingly U.S. So in a way, it's a little bit like the tariff wars. I mean, the tariff wars are not the way you manage alliances if you're worried about China and Russia. Why would you form a posse to deal with the bad guys and then start shooting at the posse? It doesn't make sense. But just sort of decoupling from the U.S. is just simply not an option. You know, the Europeans make a lot of noise about that. Europe invested about $150 billion in China, has about $150 billion invested in China, and almost $5 trillion in the U.S. It's kind of similar. And the U.S. market and the previous sunk investment into FDI in the U.S., it's similar to the Five Eyes intelligence relationship. There's so much history, so much sunk into it, so much that comes from the U.S. So, sorry, a long way of saying, like, there's no way Australia or Canada or UK are going to say we're not going to work with the U.S. anymore. Absolutely no way. Simply couldn't get the intelligence they need without it. So then what happens? I don't know. It'll be an interesting discussion. I would guess that the professionals, the intelligence professionals, continue to have very high trust in each other. And the question is really about sort of the people at the top. And so this is just a guess, I don't know, but probably the U.S. intelligence community is working with the Five Eyes partners to reassure them that there are ways to talk to the U.S. principals securely. And I don't see any evidence at all that Tulsi Gabbard or Hegseth or Mike Waltz do not value Five Eyes. They clearly do. And so they're going to want to get it right. They may not admit they made a mistake, but they're going to want to get it right. So this is it's not good, but it's not like grounds for a divorce or ending the intelligence relationship or cutting U.S. principals out of critical decisions. It's something that the professionals on all sides of the relationship are now going to have to manage, but not the first time it's happened.
And I think that's such an important point, Mike, about, yes, the administration has very broad control over these issues, but there is a community of professionals that are working below that appointee level that ensure there's continuity between administrations. And that means that we can have faith in that reliability and faith in that continuity.
So then I guess I'd love to pivot and get your by the numbers stats. Who wants to go first?
Sure, I can take that. So we're talking about data security, and I think one thing interesting about Signalgate is all the conversations that have come up about what happens in the group chats. I think we're all involved in group chats, whether it's, a group chat between a workplace or a group chat between your girlfriends where you're handling something, and we've all had that situation where someone takes something out of the group chat and does something they shouldn't with it. So I think we all there's some understanding of this, but I hope that it gets people thinking about data and data security. And I just wanted to share this stat. So there was a study done by DeMont Joy, and this is back in 2013. So that's, in terms of data and tech, that's, back in the ice ages. But in an anonymized data set of 1.5 million mobile users that span a time frame of 15 months, they could use only 4 points of data. So that would be a point of data at the time you used a phone and the place you used the phone. And that was enough to identify 95% of individuals in that data set. So over the course of 15 months, just 4 times that your phone was in your hand and in use could identify you among 1.5 million users. So we're not as secure as we think we are.
It is shocking if you're ever behind the door and someone's trying to get you to buy a marketing product, when they reveal to you how much information they can gather about any person and then use that to sell a product. It will change your mind about how you share your information online, how you use your phone.
Yeah, our phones know so much about us, more than anyone else in our lives.
Absolutely. How about you, Mike? What number do you have?
Well, I'm still reeling from that one. You know, as Trotsky said, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. You may not be interested in algorithms, but algorithms are interested in you. And I did not do Facebook for a long time because people who've been in government are pretty careful about it for all the reasons Kat just said. Now that I'm on Facebook, which is one of the best ways to stay in touch with high school friends and stuff back in the US, and a lot of people listening have this experience, I'm stunned at how they can find things out. I sent a PDF over Messenger, Facebook Messenger, to somebody that had the name of someone handwritten on it, and then who I didn't know. And that person showed up as a friend within an hour on Facebook. So clearly they can read PDFs that are attachments. And my kids tease me because when I got on Facebook, I was fascinated with monkeys, and now my inbox is inundated with monkeys. The algorithm figured out I like monkeys. My kids and wife won't let me get a pet monkey. So my number, I didn't do my homework. I admit it, and so Kat gave me one of hers. Thank you, Kat. But it's an interesting one, not surprising to me. According to YouGov polling, 74% of Americans say that this Signalgate issue, 74% said it was either very or somewhat serious, and 60% are Republicans. So,
wow.
So a large number of Democrats and independents thought this was a problem. And I think that's actually very reassuring in a way, because in a democracy, people know that they want people want their civil liberties, they want their privacy, they want all that, but they understand clearly that the government and the leaders of their government have got to be responsible with intelligence and responsible with information. And so that tells you there are political consequences, not just security consequences. And although the Trump administration has yet to acknowledge there was a problem, I bet internally a lot of people are doing things to make sure it doesn't happen again. And that's the accountability of the public, even with all the chaos we're seeing, and the broad understanding by the public that the government has responsibilities to keep them safe, and that means keeping secrets safe. So I see that as a little bit of a silver lining to this whole episode.
Yeah, and it's interesting because so much of the messaging coming from, the Trump team and the White House has been like, oh, this isn't a big deal, or who hasn't made a mistake, or none of it was classified, things like that. But I think these public polling numbers of 60% of Republicans think it was an issue. I think that indicates that the messaging that's coming out, it's not passing the sniff test. And people are like, no. And people have a gut reaction. It's something that's much easier to understand than a lot of other, technical snafus. People get it, but they see that it was an issue. So anyway, very interesting to see where it goes from here. So as we wrap up, I'd just like to point out a couple of other podcasts that might be of interest to our listeners. Michael Green is the host of the Asia Chessboard podcast that's co-produced with CSIS. And I'd also recommend checking out the USSC Live podcast series that runs recordings from our major live events, including our Election Watch events from last year and the recordings from our Sydney International Strategy Forum. You can get these on our website at ussc.edu.au or wherever you get your podcasts. Mike and Kat, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.